for me, the takeaway from the film is when you see the kind of solidarity and the kind of community that we had in recognizing that we may all have differences in ideology, differences in how we do our work, differences in approach, in strategy, but we all came together and made waves. We shook that place. And I find it really sad that we are now in this place in the world where it looks like it's getting harder and harder to even come together to fight against injustice. So that is my biggest take in Beijing, is the solidarity and the community and the comradeship that we had.
Well, thank you for that. And I'm looking into the hall to see who has questions or remarks. Please just raise your hands, and then Danny will be there with the microphone. There's one here. Can you come? For Nikki, who is part of the LGBT, the Green Party LGBT, one of the spokesperson of the Green Vienna LGBT task force.
First, I want to start with thank you, Beverley, for all the amazing work you've done, everything you've achieved. I mean, 30 years ago, I wasn't even born, and you were already fighting for lesbians, for queer women in general. I wanted to ask you if, I would say I see some parallels in what you had to fight for 30 years ago and what the debate is now about trans people, and if you would agree that there are similarities, there are parallels, and that we need this solidarity in the big community, and as women that we support trans rights the way women supported each other 30 years ago in Beijing for lesbian rights. I hope that's at least kind of clear.
I missed the question, Nikki.
If you would agree that the fight for trans rights is at a similar point as the fight for lesbian rights was 30 years ago.
Yes, I got it. I think 30 years ago, if we had the kind of language that we have now, we most likely would have included all women's rights. And I think, even in my speech, make this a conference for all women, regardless of their sexual orientation, we probably would have added gender identity and gender expression, because we do have the same oppression. We are fighting in such different silos, so separate from each other. Meanwhile, we are actually fighting the same beast, the same systems that are oppressing us. The system of patriarchy is the system that is oppressing women and queer folks and trans folks. But, it's also the same system that is pushing racism, supremacy. It's the same system that is pushing capitalism and anti-poor people and anti, disabled people and environmental. It's the same system. And yet here we are fighting so separately. That does not make any sense. Julie Dorff, who features in the film, actually says that, we would most likely have won the lesbian issue if we had pushed the envelope with trans up in the front, because then they had to land somewhere. I don't know about that, but I would hope that we get to a place where we are not as separate as we are.
In negotiations, it's very often like that sometimes you have to demand a lot more in order to get something. Even Absolutely. There you were talking, you didn't manage to get sexual orientation in, but the whole text of this paragraph, 96, I think
paragraph
it was?
96, yes.
Is very clear on that every woman or every person would have a right, etc. So yes. Sometimes you have to do that. But so at least that was done.
Yes.
If I don't see anybody else, I have one question that I thought you would maybe ask as well, because the title of the film is Lesbians Free Everyone. And it also was on at least one of the banners at the demonstration and in the tent. So how did this come about? There's Lesbians Free Everyone, I love it, but how did you come up with that slogan?
It is actually the banner itself that inspired the film. And we thought, it would be, it's very apt. Even when we were drawing it up at the lesbian tent just before the march itself, and you can see it in many different languages. Something lesbiana, what's freedom in Spanish?
Libertad. Libertad.
Yes, lesbiana, libertad todos.
Libertad para todos, todas.
And that banner was painted in various languages from the lesbian tent. I think it's in the recognition that when you find some of the most oppressed people under a particular system, when those people become free, then everyone else becomes free. Conversations around sexual autonomy and around human rights of all people. And when you push that envelope and you push to the recognition of all human rights and you include the most marginalized people, you find that everyone else then follows suit. And so Lesbians Free Everyone really is about pushing for conversations that are difficult, but conversations that are necessary in recognizing the human rights of all people. And of course, the lesbian identity is a challenging identity. And we don't even use the word lesbian. I think that came out in the film. We don't use it so much anymore. Everyone is using queer. Everyone is using, every other word except for lesbian. So when you say I am a lesbian, that on its own is revolutionary because you are cementing your identity outside of the patriarchy.
You talk about that when we include everybody, that this really has to be meant. And I think your experience, and I remember when we met when the ILGA, the International Lesbian Gay Association World Conference was in Cape Town, or Johannesburg it was, in 1999, I think. I was there.
It was in Johannesburg. ILGA was in Johannesburg
in 1999. You and others told us about the process you did to manage to get non-discrimination on sexual orientation into the South African Constitution, because that is something that's similar to what you were just saying. Can you tell us a bit about that? Because I was really amazed by this process they had done. It wasn't just writing a paper and saying we're going to vote on that, but it was a long process to go everywhere in the country. Can you tell us a bit about that?
It was a long process of recognizing that if you have people who need to understand what you are talking about, we realized very early on that we needed visibility campaigns. We realized that queerness and gay and lesbian and LGBTI people had been discriminated against mostly because of ignorance. And we needed to rally our own communities and the general public in order to make submissions to the committee that was drafting the constitution of the country. And so we needed to be able to get letters of support. We needed to be able to get these submissions coming in from all over the country. And so we really worked hard to reach out to communities, which was one-on-one, which was all the different organizations that existed. I think the human touch, one of the things that we are lacking also now in how we are not having conversations with each other is that we are not going to a farming meeting and talking about human rights across the board as queer farmers. We are not going to disability conferences where we are talking about our queerness as disabled people. We are not reaching out to each other on a very human level. And that's one of the things that really worked in our favor when I was younger. And also, let's not forget the time. The time in the early 90s was a time when the whole world was full of hope, when there was protests and the whole world was waking up to systemic oppression. I know the Berlin Wall had just come down. I know that, Tiananmen Square had just happened. There were many other things that were going on around the world where people were opening their eyes to injustices and oppression and now seeing hope, a renewed hope. So the ground was fertile. All it needed was for conversation, for disagreements that don't lead to us killing each other, but where we could meet each other somewhere. We could have conversations about freedom and say, what does freedom look like for you? And I will then explain, what does freedom look like for me? And from that individual place, we were able to come together. And I think the biggest slogan, and I know that it is seen as a socialist communist slogan, but each one teach one is a slogan that really, really helped to push our agenda, because we were all over the media. We went to every conference and workshop and meeting, just talking to one another and galvanizing the support that helped to get the Constitution adopted in the way that it was.
Thank you. Can you maybe tell us also a bit about how your prominent role that you had in Beijing, did it change your life? And if it did, in what ways?
Oh my goodness.
Maybe it didn't, I don't know.
No, well, it did in so many different ways. I had been in my own country recognizing the fact that the gay movement, and I call it the gay movement even though it said gay and lesbian and it's supposed to be all-inclusive, but I started recognizing that gay issues were dominating, and I started having to fight for space and for lesbian issues to be recognized within my own organization, where it was just assumed that we are same and we are talking the same language and we're talking about the same things. I will give you an example. I was part of an HIV/AIDS committee within my organization, GLOW. And one of the things that we did when we, also remember HIV and AIDS at the time was taking a lot of our comrades. A lot of our friends were dying. And one of my mentors, Simon Nkodi, would say, lesbians would be the ones taking care of sick and dying gay men. So I committed myself to learning about the virus and doing a lot of education campaigns. But then in all these education campaigns, the focus was always on gay men. And there was very little about lesbian health and lesbian wellness. And so I started pushing and asking, why are we not having those conversations? Also, violence against women. And at the time, there was a lot of rape, especially of young women and girls, but also of lesbians. And these issues were not being addressed. So I left home to Beijing feeling very disillusioned. And I'd already had many fights within my organization about these issues. And so when I arrived in Beijing and saw the solidarity and saw how many other lesbians were also having similar issues in their own countries and their own organizations, that really gave me the courage. And it also made me feel like I was not alone and I was not isolated. I think that radicalized me, because I came back home with a newer and a clearer understanding of the global systemic issue, which then is also within our own movements where, particularly the patriarchy of African gay men, we don't talk enough about it. and I started raising it. So I became even more radical when I came back from Beijing. But here is the flip side. There was a lot of discrimination. I was, accosted in the streets. There was a time when my life was really in danger because I was so out of the closet and out and vocal everywhere. And then I went to the conference and made that speech. And I remember when I landed back in Johannesburg, and I was in my township in Soweto, I would have groups of men coming to congratulate me for standing up for my shit. And that's what they kept saying. Oh my God, you're really standing up for this, aren't you? All the way to the United Nations? Wow. So you really, so how it changed my life is that all of a sudden I felt safer.
Wow, that's great. Just include one very personal note on that. Something similar in a different way happened to me when I was at the first ILGA conference, the World Conference in Vienna in 1989, here at Engelsplatz, Jugendherberge am Engelsplatz. Hat die International Lesbian and Gay Association ihr Welttreffen gehabt. Sorry, I switched to English again. Who did organize that. And I was there and they asked me to be interpreter. I'm an interpreter originally for English and Spanish. So they asked me to be interpreter for some of the Latin Americans. And I said, yeah, of course, I'd love to do that. And then there were 120 lesbians and gays. I don't remember trans people at that time. It was in 1989.
We didn't have the language, I think, at the time.
Yeah, it wasn't the language either. Yeah. So from all over the world, we went to Mauthausen together to see the museum of the concentration camp and the pink triangle that Roselyn and Roselyn had put there in 80 something. And for me, it was like, I never was afraid of saying I'm a lesbian, but hearing about people from so many different parts of the world, and the situation was, 100 times more difficult than in Austria in 89. It wasn't easy then, but in comparison, I felt, what should I be afraid of in Austria? Yeah. And so in this community of lesbians and gays from all over the world, it helped me as well to be more confident in what I am. Yeah. So thanks for what you said. And sorry, you want to ask a question?
So thank you so much for producing this movie. And actually about your last answer, you were talking a bit about intersectionality, about gender, but what was also very nice to see in the movie was different age, different generations, and also different ethnicities, different race. So it felt a little part of my soul, I would say, to see that. And I think my question is, you were saying when you came back to Johannesburg, that people were congratulating you, but you also had other people, from Peru, Mexico, Uganda, and we all know the situation in Uganda, so yeah. And I was wondering how it was for the other participants to go back, were they not afraid to be so public about human rights, which is sad that you have to fear that you're advocating for human rights, but maybe, it had maybe consequences. So yeah, that's my question.
I think the question is about other people going back home to their own countries and if they were affected and if they felt safer, particularly in countries where discrimination and violence continues. I think that was the question.
Yes, thank you.
Perfect. Yes. I think I had a friend, and I think you saw her featured, Kagendo Murungi from Kenya. And Kagendo, for example, had to change her name and had to start using a pseudonym after the Beijing conference. I know that there had been other things, but being seen at the Beijing conference and being vocal about being a lesbian Kenyan person in her own home became very difficult for her because I think she came from a prominent family and they knew the name Murungi. And all of a sudden it was all in the papers that there's a Kenyan that is disgracing the country by going out and talking about being a lesbian. And so it became difficult for her to even go home to Nairobi. And yeah, for until her passing, she used a pseudonym. And that one of the reasons she's not really found in the history books is because, you know, if you knew to look for Mary Sigaji, you would find that there's a lot of activism by this person, Mary Sigaji. But who was Mary Sigaji? Mary Sigaji was actually Kagendo Murungi. And so that's an example of some of the backlash that happened. I was not with many other lesbians, and so I don't know what the reaction was in their own communities and in their own countries, but that is one story that I know from my friend Kakendo. Also, you know, we were very brave in Beijing, and to come back home, it depended on how the country itself reported on the issues. My biggest gripe, I think, was that there was a lot of erasure of particularly the lesbian participation and the lesbian disruption. And the lesbian disruption was big enough that it should have probably been a lot more prominent in news around the world, but it wasn't. And for me, the silence around the lesbian issues and the lesbian participation and disruption of Beijing meant that we continue to be silenced. So when a film like Lesbians Free Everyone comes out and people say, oh, we knew about Beijing, but we didn't know this happened, that is erasure. It continues to say we don't exist. And I think that's one of the reasons I made the film, is because we continue to be erased. Our stories continue to be erased. So there wasn't as much prominent media recognition of lesbian activism in Beijing for it to have the kind of backlash. And that is really my opinion, because that was my experience at the time. I'm sure there are others who may have had experiences that were different to me.
So first, I just want to thank you for this movie. And I mean, for me, a queer woman of color, to see you on a big screen in Vienna is something very, very big, because Vienna is not.
Thank you.
Vienna in Austria in general is something I could go on for hours, but what I really want to say is thank you for this movie, and to see the solidarity there was 30 years ago is just remarkable and beautiful, and to see this just not friendship but sisterhood and really all of this is something that really could like bring me to tears, because this is a couple of days ago had a very racist incident when the Austrian police, and it was not fun. But the thing is that the worst part of it was that I know that I can't go and talk to the Black community because I am queer, or the queer community because I am Black, and that there is not necessarily this solidarity in Austria or even like in the world right now. And I really just wanted to thank you for this visibility of this solidarity that there was 30 years ago between all ethnicities and sexual orientation and gender identity and so on. So thank you.
Thank you so much. I think what you're saying is very important, and I'm sorry that you went through that. But that was also one of the things that really pushed my activism when I was younger, when I had to find community amongst people who understood the intersections of, race and gender and sexual orientation and gender identity. And I found a community within my small organization that understood that, at least for a while, until, the differences started coming up. I hope you find community, my sibling. I hope you find community, because it helps to have, even if it's just 1 or 2 or 3 other people that have that community, that understanding of these intersections, because we don't live one life, one-dimensional way of being. We are a multifaceted people. So yeah, thank you.
And I heard that at many conferences and when talking about, when I was at different places, also in Africa, also as a politician, always meeting with LGBT groups, and especially in Uganda, but also in Zimbabwe, and also South Africa. The thing that they, like this African woman in Beijing told you, you're not African. There is no African lesbian. Yes. And this is so, I find it so outrageous, because I heard from African activists, what I found amazing, that in many of well, in all of the colonized countries, the anti-LGBT or the homophobic laws mostly came about with the colonizers, meaning that LGBT people, of course, existed before. Yeah, I mean, it's also logical. But how do you deal with that now? Because it's not, I think, as I heard here, it's not getting a lot better. And all those former independence leaders, like Museveni, Mugabe is already gone, but still there are following him. This is they were independence leaders. They fought for freedom. And then they go and talk about this is un-African. I mean, they didn't know their own communities, I guess. So how do you react on that now?
Well, I mean, it's ridiculous, as you say. But more than that, I am finding that while we do a lot of research and find that there were a lot of very, very queer, very trans, very intersex, very gay, very lesbian leaders and chiefs and healers and just regular folk in the villages long before the boat arrived from anywhere. And we know these stories, but what's really interesting is that even while these stories are being told in our own countries, there's a tendency to divorce the very obvious sexual orientation or gender identity from these folks. There are many women kings that we have had. I will speak to Zimbabwe, I will speak to South Africa, I will speak to even Uganda, who had a bisexual king of the Baganda at one point, who was then demonized when the colonizer arrived. And so the people just took it on. And it's very interesting how even he, as well known as he is not referred to whenever they say this is an African. He was there and everybody knew of his queerness before the boat arrived. So it's a very interesting cognitive dissonance where there is the truth, it is staring you in the face, but you then kind of, towing a rhetoric and a line that I suppose serves the status quo. And while we can unpack and delve deep into the why, and of course for me the why has always been, the threat of patriarchy and the threat of supremacy in all its forms. I don't think that they think very much when they say things like that. They're just really repeating things by rote. And even when logic is staring you in the face, they're not listening. And so it's very difficult to have conversations with people who are very clear about what they're saying, but they have no real understanding of what they're saying.
I think it's one like fake news or things that people don't think about if they thought, but
yeah, it's accepted. It's accepted. You can just say things, and because everyone agrees, it must mean it's true.
Yeah, we know now a lot of other things that fake news make our lives very difficult. Yeah,
and what's sad is that the whole world is now at a place where you can look back at history. Now we have so much more information than historically 50 years ago. People did not have information at their fingertips. We can look back at history and say, just because this was a law, that did not make it right. Just because everyone agreed with one thing did not make that thing right. And yet we are still moving as though we don't have this information. I find the world to be a very interesting place, I'll be honest with you. The kind of confident stupidity is ruling the world right now. And
that's a good term. I like the confident stupidity. Okay, sort of to wrap up, I have one final question, which refers to all the hope and the positive thing that was there in the 90s, as you referred to as well, not just in South Africa, not just in Beijing, but in so many other levels. And that also in South Africa, and I remember when I was there in 99, it was so great. We went on a bus I don't remember where to, and there were all those lesbians and gays were singing Kose Tsikelele Africa, this freedom song. It still touches me now, all this hope that was there. Sorry, I get emotional about these things. Anyway, but sort of referring to where we live now, what can you tell us from your side, from all this hope, all these struggles, all these fights you have had, all these victories you have won for our times now, all over the world, at different levels, that there is still hope, and that of course, we need to go on fighting. But what kind of other remarks or other kind of ideas would you want to give us to not get desperate about that things are getting only worse but not better?
I think we recognize things are getting worse the more we focus on just how bad things are. And I'm not saying we need to put our heads in the sand, but we also do need to continuously be vigilant and see where the positives are. Otherwise, we will go mad, especially as activists. The one thing you do not want to do is to lose hope, because then they win. But I think there's a way in which we have moved away from community that is alarming for me. And I think I will continue to talk about that for the rest of my life, because the impact of Beijing was in community. The only way we can fight the crippling capitalism that is right now enveloping the world is through community. The homophobia, the transphobia is through community. And community requires that while we recognize all our differences, we also need to see where our solidarity is what's going to save us in these communities. Let me break down for you what one of my closest friends would say about what is community. And sibling sitting in the audience who made that last comment, I'm referring this to you as well. Community is, according to my friend, when you know where to go to buy one loose cigarette. It's when you know where to go when you want some spiritual help, when you have the beer hall or the pub around the corner that is safe for you. You know where to get all your needs met, however small they are. That is community. As queer people, we've lost a little bit of that, where we know where to get our different needs met in community without it being so divided. I go to spaces now that is predominantly Black lesbian. Great, fantastic. I was the only one I knew when I was 17, 18 years old, until I got to Beijing and met others, of course, you know. There weren't many like me. And now there's thousands of lesbians in a space. And then I look around and there are no gay men. There are no trans men. There are no, where are the rest of my siblings? Because we continue to be so separate. Community is what's going to save us. We need to really get past our egos and actually recognize that we need community in order to be able to resist. Resistance is crucial right now where we are, and it is community that is going to actually rise up and fight against the fascism that we are seeing. And even though we're tired as, you know, the elders, I know I called myself an elder, even though many of us are tired because we've been there, we've been doing this. The young ones need us so that they're not repeating the same mistakes, so that they're not recreating the wheel. That also means that we need to be talking to each other more intergenerationally and listening to each other, because the young ones also have some brilliant ideas, except when they think that they are the only ones who've come up with it. But young ones have really new and interesting ways of approaching the world and approaching things. And we just need to really be patient and listen to one another. We can't stop this madness. I've been there. I have seen a country come from the worst shit to being free, and now we're in the worst shit again. I've seen the freedom. We can. This is possible. And so I always have that hope.
Thank you so much for Beverley. And also, that I could mention, also the humor. I think that's also important to survive.
Yes.
Thank you so very much to be with us this evening. Thanks all of you for staying.
Thank you.
Thank you and bye-bye.
Bye,
See you
everyone.